Shalom and greetings, friends. Thank you for clicking on this video teaching titled The Circumcision Schism. And most of my viewers, you probably know what physical circumcision is, but schism, what does schism mean? It's a more uncommon word that's utilized in our modern societies today, English-speaking societies, unless we study theology and get to higher levels of theology or research history. So let me define the word schism for those of you out there who may not be sure of what I mean by that. A schism, it is a late Latin word, a Vulgate Latin word, and it simply means it can mean a split or to split or a division. And a schism is used in modern English that means a separation or division of factions, a formal breach of union within a Christian church is how it's commonly used. The offense of attempting to produce such a breach or union, or a disunion is another way of wording a schism, or discord, or causing discord or division. Now, schism can also be referred to in any breach or break or division into two separate factions. Doesn't have to be Christianity, but an example of a schism, we see the Great Schism. There's two great schisms in Christianity. We see in the 11th century where Eastern and Western Europe, where Catholicism was splitting into more of an Eastern and Western Europe, and different popes coming up and even going against each other. And then we have the Protestant Reformation later on, and even into the 13th, 14th centuries. We see protesters of Catholic Church. We see Martin Luther and many others coming later on. And so that is another great schism that has happened. But in this teaching, I'm not referring to anything like that, of course. It's the Circumcision Schism. And just the doctrine or the teachings of circumcision, physical circumcision, spiritual circumcision, and the differences in theology and understanding of this has caused a lot of division, a lot of unnecessary division. Now, in the King James Version, the Old King James, or the New King James, we only find the word schism once. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 25. And it says that, and this is the Apostle Shaul, or many of you know him as Paul. It says here that there should be no schism in the body, but that the members should have the same care for one another. And he continues on there, that there shouldn't be any schism. And so the schism that I'm referring to in this message is between Jews and Gentiles. And it goes back to this first century in the teachings, and we're going to have to go into the Brit Hadashah. But I'm going to show you, before we get into this, we need to understand the differences between the written law, or the letter of the law, as some people say, of the books of Moses, or Moshe, his Hebrew word, his name. And then we have the oral law, or the oral commandments, the law, the teachings. Torah simply means instructions or teachings. And when we refer to scriptures, we believe that they come from the Creator and they were inspired. Now, in Orthodox Judaism, even among the Pharisees and the Sadducees and even the scribes of the first century, there was the oral law, as we refer to it as today. It simply hadn't been written down yet, but the rabbinical leaders believed sincerely that these were oral commandments that were given to Moses, given to Moshe, but they just weren't written down. We don't see them in his 5 books there. And so that they were just handed down from generation to generation, and that they are equal or even higher authority than the written law or Torah scriptures of Moshe because they believed that they were expounded upon and explained in more detail, and but this is where many of us differ and disagree in the schism between, say, the Hebrew writings of the Tanakh and the Brit Hadashah, where Yeshua, the Messiah, many of you refer to his Greek name, Jesus, that the Greeks changed his name to, and also Shaul, Paul. They taught according to the written law, but they did teach against the oral commandments, the commandments of men that were added to the Torah or contradictory to the Torah, and or just simply put as a higher priority, that are not explicitly in the Torah. So we need to understand that. If we were going to go in to understand Paul's writings, Shaul, we need to understand the difference between the oral and the written Torah, because he did not teach against the written laws or commandments of our Creator that Moshe wrote down for us, and neither did the Messiah. And I pointed that out. If you go to my video teachings titled, Who Are the Judaizers?, I give many scriptures to prove, to show that. But just jumping forward here to go into explaining the commandments of men verses, I'll just give one scripture here of Shaul, or in Titus chapter 1 verse 14. It says, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men who turn from the truth. So these are commandments of men, not commandments of our Creator, but these are commandments of men, and in fables and stories. Some of you have studied from the Kabbalah, and I've even had Orthodox and ex-Orthodox Jewish believers explain to me some of the Kabbalah and the stories, and even in deep into it, and some of it implies that even stories in the Tanakh are just good moral stories. Didn't really actually happen, and but they're good lessons to learn from. And we see a lot of Christianity, even atheism, you find that teaching that kind of goes around, and they're just fables, they're stories. But we need to believe our scriptures, that they are true, they were inspired. It's a book of history, a book of prophecy, a book of revelation, a book of peace, to show you how to love Him, how to love each other, and those two great commandments, how to love Him first, and then secondly to love our fellow human beings. The whole law and the Torah were based, the written law and Torah. But mankind likes to add. And in Joshua, we're told in two different places, be careful. We need to be careful not to add and not to take away from these scriptures. And so an example, let me give an example of an oral law versus a written law. In the book of Moshe, we see in Exodus 23:19 about not boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk. You know, say a kid, but a kid is not, it's talking about our children, but a baby goat, don't boil it in the mother's milk. We see it again in Exodus, or Shemot, 34:26, and then in Deuteronomy, or Devarim, 14:21. So here we see three examples, and the wording isn't different. It doesn't say anything about mixing meat with dairy specifically, but here's where the oral law comes in. In an Orthodox, strict Orthodox Judaism, they say you cannot even have dairy and meat in the same kitchen, or in the same refrigerator maybe, or even especially within the same meal of the person that's eating it, because it's not supposed to be ingested at the same time. And so that's an oral law that Orthodox Judaism says that, well, it's based upon, and it's expounding and magnifying the book of Moses here. But we look at Moses, he says, first of all, it says a goat. It doesn't say anything about cows or any other clean animals that are okay to eat, but it says a goat. And then secondly, it talks about boiling boiling, or we could say cooking, high temperature cooking or boiling. And thirdly, it's with the specific baby of that goat, not some other goat's, kids or anything like that. So there's three things there we see that are very specific, and we should, as we look deeper into the Torah, we see a lot of commandments that our Creator shows that He cares about the ecology, the environment. He says with birds, don't kill a clean bird if it's got babies in the nest. And He cares about those babies. He cares about His creation. He tells us to be good stewards of the creation. So we need to be careful, as I said, not to add commandments and judge others or cause divisions or schisms because of oral laws that are not explicit. Now, it does say not to boil a kid in its mother's milk. And we should not teach against that. But again, if someone feels obligated that they need to build this fence, here's we got the Torah, the written Torah, build a big fence of commandments so that we don't even come close to breaking those literal ones. If someone feels obligated to do that, well then whatever is not of your conscience, if you go against your conscience, you're still sinning. You are defiling your conscience, and then when it comes to real commandments, you will defile that as well. So we need to be careful we're not defiling our conscience. We don't want to cause people to stumble over these issues, and even circumcision as we get into this. We shouldn't cause divisions or schisms. But, we need to understand the difference between the oral law and the written law. And that's where Moshe, taught, the Abrahamic covenants and also the covenants with Israel. But we need to realize that Shaul taught that. And how did he teach circumcision based upon that? We're going to get to that. And as another example of the letter of the law, we're told also to not, when we have to use the restroom, to dig a hole and then cover it with dirt when we're done, the fecal matter. Well, how many of you go into your backyards and do that, or outside and do that? We don't see much of that in Orthodox Judaism either. So we have to see what is the intent. What is the Creator's intent there? He says there's bacteria, there are germs, there are going to be diseases. So some laws are health laws for us to observe. And so we are following the principle. We flush it into the ground. It goes into septic tanks or areas where it can decompose and the environment can decompose it. And in the right ways, it can become fertilizer too. So we need to realize that if we just stick to the letter of the law alone, we can make things ultra strict, so strict that it becomes a yoke, a bondage to us that our Creator never intended. And so when the Pharisees were accusing our Messiah of breaking the Shabbats, he wasn't breaking them. He was breaking the oral laws, the commandments that they had come up with, but not the written law. And he pointed out even when an ox falls in the ditch, even if when David was eating the showbread, the holy bread, he shows that even picking in the field, his disciples weren't earning a living. They weren't making money out of it. They were hungry. Kind of like going to your refrigerator and taking out some food. They were traveling. They were doing the work. The priests were, the ministry, even in the temples, they were working the hardest, the most on the Shabbats than any other day of the week. So it's not the act of physical labor if you're doing a ministerial service or going to a congregation or a synagogue to preach. Oxes fall in the ditches, you might get a flat tire, you might have a problem. But, there's oral laws that become so strict that you can't even turn on a light switch because it says don't kindle a fire. So we see certain laws were for that time that were difficult to light a fire, but it's not difficult to turn on a light switch. Or turn on your car. There's spark plugs, and so they say little fires, little combustions are going on. But So we have to be careful. We're not adding to the Torah. We need to look to the Creator's intent. This is where we need the Spirit to understand how to keep it. For example, if you're unclean, if you're considered unclean till sunset according to the written law, well, does that mean you need to quarantine yourself? You touch a dead animal and you need to quarantine yourself from everybody because you've washed, you've cleansed from that, from touching the bad bacteria, or you're unclean in any physical way until sunset or for that particular day or a couple days more. Do you have to quarantine yourself or just cleanse yourself? And there are certain ceremonial laws. You can't go to the tabernacle. You can't go to the temple. You can't offer a sacrifice, when you're ceremonially unclean. Doesn't mean being ceremonially unclean doesn't mean you have to quarantine yourself and you're too unclean to fellowship with people, to pray with people, to get together with people. And so we don't have the Shekinah glory return to this earth other than we have the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, we have angels, ministering spirits, but we don't have that literal return of what the Israelites had in that tabernacle. We have access to that in prayer and in relationship, but our Messiah has not come back yet literally. The third temple has not been built literally. We are the temple, yes, figuratively, and we are stones building up a royal priesthood and a temple. So there's analogies, there's metaphors and allegories. We need to understand the Hebraic mindset. But we also need to realize that when he literally comes to this earth, he does have expectations. We're going to get to that in Ezekiel 44, even in regard to circumcision. But in terms of a human life, in this human planet, and where we're at now, we need to be real careful. We are not doing away with this, but not also adding oral, rabbinical, ultra-strict commandments that are not really there. We need to understand what they were applied to, why they were applied, what is the Creator, how does it show us how to love Him, how does it show us how to love each other and get the gospel out better and more faithfully. So, getting to circumcision here, or the fact that the Apostle Paul didn't teach against the written Torah. Let's go to Acts chapter 24. In Acts 24, he's dragged into court, the Roman court system. Felix the governor is judging the case because here the rabbinical leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees as well, were trying to put Paul to death. He was a traitor. He was one of their high-ranking leaders, and all of a sudden he turns against them in their eyes because he accepts the Messiah. And so here they're trying to put him to death through the Roman court system legally. And this is what Paul's defense. This is what he says in verse 14 of Acts chapter 24. But this I confess to you, according to the way which they call a sect or a cult, so I worship the God of my fathers. Now he was a Benjamite. He was a Hebrew of the Hebrews in the Sanhedrin and a high-ranking leader previous to his calling to accept Messiah. He says, I worship the same Creator of my fathers, the Hebrews, believing all things, not most things or some things, but all things, that which were written in the Torah, or the law, as it says in most English translations. But again, law is referring, the Torah is referring to instructions, and the prophets. Not only the instructions of the 5 books of Moshe, but also all the prophets. Paul believed and taught according to that, and even circumcision. And we need to understand that. If you want more scriptures like this, please go to my video teachings, Who Are the Judaizers? But I want to go forward with, how did he teach circumcision? Let's go to Acts chapter 17. Let's go back a little bit here. And beginning in verse 10, it says, Then the brethren immediately sent Shaul and Silas away by night to Berea. When they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews, the Jewish people. Now he's preaching to the Jewish people, the rabbinical people, and whatever Gentiles were there, of course. These were more fair-minded, or more noble, than those in Thessalonica. Now, how were they more noble? How were they more fair-minded? In that they received the word with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily. I mean, they didn't just believe him emotionally because he was a charismatic preacher out there. They searched the scriptures. They checked up on him. And I want you to check up on me as I go through this teaching on the Circumcision Schism. They searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. And of course, there's no doubt he taught about the Messiah and how he fulfilled the prophecies of the scriptures, and also circumcision, as we'll see. They didn't have his letters back then to the Romans or to the Galatians and to the Ephesians. Those were letters that he wrote to those congregations, but they weren't shared and passed around and copied and duplicated for a long time. So these Jewish people in Berea, in the synagogues there, all they had was the Torah and the Tanakh, as we say, which includes all the writings and the prophets, and as well as the writings of Moshe. So how did Paul teach? Let's go to the Torah. Let's go to his instructions, and let's go to that. And before I do, let me also cover Acts 15 briefly, because this is where the Christians today see we don't have to keep these commandments other than what's given to the Gentiles here in Acts chapter 15. But let's understand this. Again, we have to understand the written law, the Torah of Moses, and the oral, which they were also believing came from Moshe. And certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moshe, the laws, you cannot be saved. So here is saying you cannot receive salvation as a human being. You cannot unless you are physically circumcised. And so this is what I propose to you. That part of it, that tail end of verse 1, is coming from an oral law that they believe, that they've expounded upon from the written Torah, that they believe was handed down, and that you cannot be saved as a human, receive salvation, eternal salvation, as a gift, unless you are circumcised physically. And so that's what I propose. Let's continue here. Therefore, Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension, no small disagreement, disputing with them. Jumping down to verse 5. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed, these were Pharisees who had come to accept Messiah, who became true believers in the Messiah, who was crucified in that century, around 30 A.D., on the Pesach day, the 14th day of the first month, according to the Creator's calendar. They rose up and they believed, saying, it is necessary to circumcise these Gentiles and command them to keep the law of Moses. Now again, it doesn't say the whole law, the whole written law, the letter of the law, but it's referring also to the oral law and what they were teaching on that they had to be circumcised based from the written law, of course, but teaching that salvation only came through by that to humans, and they couldn't receive it beforehand. So we can go back to the Torah. We can see that foreigners and uncircumcised people were allowed to be part of Israel and even live, not just as servants or slaves, but live among them. They weren't allowed to keep the Passover, or the Pesach, lamb, and they couldn't do the ceremonial aspects of that while uncircumcised. But we don't do that today. There's no temple to do that, and we don't do that whether you're Orthodox Jewish people today or whether you're believers, Messianic, Christian, Hebrew roots. We do more of a Seder. We do more of, many of us follow the example of Messiah with the foot washing and the bread and the wine, and along with the Seder as well, which is good. But we need to understand, let's be careful about how we teach this topic of circumcision and not cause division by trying to force Gentiles to be physically circumcised. And on the other hand, we can't be like mainstream Christians and put people down who want to be physically circumcised, because we're going to see Paul teaches that physical circumcision is profitable. It is beneficial. It does offer birthright promises. But in terms of eternal salvation, we need to be careful here. And Acts 15 is not talking about the whole law of Moshe, all the commandments. And as bona fide proof of that, and please don't get offended if you're offended by me saying that, because they're given 4 commandments here, in verse 19 and 20, that they should abstain from things polluted to idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. Well, Gentiles will say, well, that means I don't have to keep the Sabbaths. I don't have to keep the Shabbats or the Moedims because it's not commanded here in Acts chapter 15. That 4th commandment of the 10 is not mentioned here in Acts chapter 14. The 7th one is, and the 2nd one is. But you know what? We don't see the 6th commandment listed there, thou shalt not murder. Is it okay to be a serial killer? Because it's not, if you're a Gentile, and it's not mentioned there about murder in Acts chapter 15, or lying, or stealing, or coveting, or taking our Creator's name in vain. So that is bona fide proof. If you think it's okay to just break those commandments and as a Gentile, well, then you're misunderstanding Acts chapter 15. It's actually the only logical conclusion is that Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem conference, is covering issues and arguments that Gentiles and Jews were having. What should we keep and what should we not keep? Things that they all agreed upon was not on the table. What they disagreed upon was on the table. And circumcision is one of them. Physical circumcision. And Paul was teaching, again, according to the written Torah, that we don't see it as an explicit commandment to receive salvation as a human being. And how did Paul teach that? Let's go to the Torah here. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, in verse 16, it says, therefore circumcise the foreskin of your hearts, and be stiff-necked no longer. So here's the first mention of spiritual circumcision, circumcision of the heart. It's not just a new covenant, New Testament, idea or teaching. Again, the New Covenant is based upon the Old Covenant Scriptures. The Old Covenant Scriptures are our foundation. Christianity, the roots of Christianity is Judaism or Israelism, or being grafted into Israel, and the covenant is our foundation. It's a renewed covenant, like a remarriage. If there's been a divorce and you get remarried, doesn't mean you can just neglect the commandments of the previous marriage that regulate love and unity and faithfulness to each other. No, those commandments of faithfulness go into the next covenant as well, new covenant as we call it. And that comes from Jeremiah 31, a new covenant too, prophesied. But Deuteronomy, or Devarim chapter 30, let's jump over to chapter 30 here. And in verse 6 it says, and the Creator, your Elohim, will circumcise your heart. Shalom and greetings, friends. Thank you for clicking on part 2, titled the Circumcision Schism. And before I pick up where I left off in part 1, let me just say, because there were some comments of people who misunderstand, or maybe they just didn't listen to the whole thing and got offended and made some comments. I do not teach that physical circumcision is required to receive salvation as a human being, eternal salvation. I do not teach that. I teach according to the written Torah and the New Testament, as many of you call it. But Paul, the Apostle Shaul, did not teach against the written Torah. In part 1, I covered the difference between the oral law, or Torah, and the written. The rabbinical oral law gets very strict, and sincerely they believe that it was handed down to them generation to generation from Moses, or Moshe as we say his name in Hebrew. And so there's been a lot of schisms, misunderstandings. Protestant theology says you don't have to worry about it, it's not beneficial at all physically, and rabbinical systems on the other end of the pendulum saying that it is a requirement for eternal salvation. And so I'm trying to teach this accurately from the Scriptures, and there's a lot of people out there who are offended about this topic. Please do not get offended. The secular hospitals do not do it God's way. Our Creator gives instructions. For example, on the 8th day, if you feel obligated for physical circumcision for your baby boys, not girls, please also, that is mutilation to circumcise girls. And to not do it our Creator's way, for example, if the hospitals, the secular hospitals, think, okay, well, if you leave the hospital, you're not going to come back. Chances are most people are not going to come back on the 8th day to have it done. So they want to do it in the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd day, and that's against the scriptural instructions. If you feel obligated, I'm not trying to pressure anybody or push anybody, but if you feel obligated to have your baby boy circumcised, go to the Orthodox, a rabbi with plenty of experience. Don't go to a rookie rabbi. And if you're going to rely on the hospitals, really look into it. Research the topic. And try to make sure it's done properly. Not too much, not too little. But the Orthodox, at least the Jewish rabbinical leaders, have at least preserved that from generation. And they're very strict. They are very meticulous in perfecting the method, and there's ways to do it, but also with all medical procedures, realize that there are risks, always, and any kind of surgical procedures. So we're talking about life, physical life as a human being. If you want to be more blessed and do it our Creator's way, really look into it and be careful. There's a lot, just like with every topic out there, whether it be archaeology, whether it be history, whether it be nutrition, whether it be religion, whether it be science. You see doctorate's degrees, scholars disagreeing with each other. You'll find very strong arguments and very heated arguments and debates between the most educated, levels of education, and so be careful. Usually people who discourage circumcision, they'll give examples of how it's not supposed to be done against the Scriptures, and it's gross, it's horrible. I feel sorry for victims out there that have been mutilated and have this grudge and bitterness against the Jewish people or against the Scriptures because they were a victim of abuse in this. And so my heart goes out to you. I feel sorry. There are methods to regrow skin, and I'm not familiar with it. I haven't researched it. I don't encourage it. I just encourage you to research. There is help out there if you feel like you've been victimized and you need help out there. Google search some of these words, some of these key topics. And so I just want to encourage that. I want to teach from the Scriptures, though. And if you don't believe in the Scriptures, then this message is not for you. And if you're an atheist or if you're anti-Semitic in any way, this topic will offend you if you try to understand it from the Scriptures. So I want to proceed with this, covering this ground and this introduction, because part one I didn't quite cover this, and realize that there's some heated comments and discouragements, and I will remove all comments that accuse of lying or telling lies or name calling or showing any bitterness or anything that's inappropriate, or any links to nude pictures or videos of how these things should or shouldn't be done. So I just want to warn you about that. And if you want to make a comment, you want to discuss it based from a scriptural point of view, I welcome you to. I'm not afraid of that. I'm not afraid of people disagreeing with me. But I do remove ones that are inappropriate. Let me warn you about that. So let's get to the Scriptures where I left off. I was showing that the Apostle Shaul, he was teaching to the Bereans in Acts chapter 17, and to the Jewish people, circumcision, the new covenant understanding, which is based upon the Scriptures and not against the written law. Not, of course, the oral law was something that he did teach against. That anything that's against the written Torah. And not that traditions are bad. We all have traditions, no matter what culture you come from. Traditions in general, let me say, are not bad, unless they go against His Word. Pagan origins or idolatry or any of the commandments, breaking any of His specific commandments here. We have to be careful we don't teach those as doctrines of commandments that come from Him, if they really don't. So let's be careful about that. But I left off in Deuteronomy, or as we say in Hebrew, Devarim, chapter 30, in verse 6. It says here, "And our Creator, our Elohim, will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants." Spiritual circumcision, as we say. "To love Him with all of your heart, with all of your soul, that you may live." Now, of course, this is speaking to those who are living. So it's referring to that you may live onward, that you may receive eternal salvation, that you may be saved, but it's based upon circumcision of the heart. And if you're not circumcised of the heart, then physical circumcision is of no value. It is, spiritually speaking, and this is what we'll get into with Paul's writings, Shaul, in a little bit here. But I'm teaching based upon what he taught, and he taught from the Scriptures. Now let's go to chapter 32. We need to teach this accurately. If you're an Orthodox Jewish rabbinical leader or any Jew out there, I want to encourage you to do it our Creator's way and understand this from the proper understanding, because if you don't, He will use a rebellious nation. He will use us Gentiles, as it says here in Devarim 32 in verses 21. It says, "They have provoked me," our Creator speaking, "they have provoked me to jealousy by what is not me. They have provoked me to anger by their foolish idols," or anything that puts anything above Him or equal to Him. "I will provoke them to jealousy by those who are not a nation. I will move them to anger by a foolish nation." And of course, He will raise up stones if He has to, even if we foolish ones out here do not do it. If nobody will do it, He will resurrect and raise up whoever He wants to, whatever He wants to. So let's really make sure we understand this from the scriptural point of view and not get overly dogmatic about ambiguous teachings or doctrines that are not specifically found in here. Now, let me also say the Abrahamic covenant still lives on today. And so the blessings, the birthright promises are still continuing on today, and that does involve physical circumcision. And we'll see that Paul teaches that it is beneficial. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But let's continue here in Jeremiah, the prophets, because he taught according to the prophets as well as the law, the Torah of Moshe. In Jeremiah chapter 4, and in verse 4, it says, "Circumcise yourself to our Creator." What kind of circumcision is he talking about here? "Take away the foreskins of your hearts," the fleshly parts that are not needed for eternal salvation, the lifestyles that are inappropriate, is what spiritual circumcision is. "You men of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem, lest my fury come forth like fire," trials, tribulations, holocausts, "and burn so that no one can quench it because of the evil of your doings." So we got to be careful, even if our tachanotes, our traditions, are against this word and we're not following it his way, then we are bringing curses on ourselves. Bad fruits will be the results, and we want good fruits. And I don't teach any prosperity gospel that you're going to be a multimillionaire or a millionaire in this physical life just because you're following his instructions, but you will be more blessed spiritually and physically than otherwise, and he's got a purpose and a calling for everybody. And so let's continue here, and also in Jeremiah, let's jump over to chapter 9, and in verses 25 and 26 here, it says, "Behold, the days are coming, says our Creator, that I will punish all those who are circumcised." Circumcised. I will punish those who are circumcised, of course physically, "and the uncircumcised." So both. It says Egypt, Judah. Here we have Egypt and Judah in the same camp here of punishment, whether you're circumcised or not. "Edom and the peoples of Ammon, Moab, and all who are of the farthest corners of the earth," of course, "who dwell in the wildernesses even. For all these nations are uncircumcised." Spiritually, he says, "and all the house of Israel are uncircumcised in the heart." So we see, again, if you're not spiritually circumcised, physical circumcision is of no value, and we're going to get to that. We have to understand the foundation of the Scriptures to really understand the New Covenant teachings of the Apostles. Now let's jump also over to Ezekiel. We see Ezekiel chapter 44. Now Ezekiel 44, it's after covering the third temple, as many people call it, because it has not been built yet. We have the first temple was destroyed. Jeremiah warned of that, and the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, came in and conquered just like the prophets warned, because the leaders of Judah and even Israel was conquered by the Assyrians. Judah, the two tribes of Benjamin and Levi, Levi and Judah, were conquered by the Babylonians, and the temple was finally destroyed the first time, and then it was rebuilt by Nehemiah and Ezra, and then that was destroyed in 70 A.D. So Ezekiel talks about a temple in a description that has never been built. And so you either have to conclude that Ezekiel is a false prophet, a crackpot prophet, or that this is a future temple and that the book of Ezekiel is a book of prophecy that has not been fulfilled yet. And I have a teaching on the Ezekiel 33 warning to show that Ezekiel is a book of prophecy. It's not, all been fulfilled yet. There's plenty of evidence, even in the book itself, in the earlier chapters. So this is a future temple that the Mashiach, the Messiah, will be part of, and it may get started before he comes back or comes to this earth, but he will definitely restore all things through it. And in verses, 44, verses 7 through 9, it says, when you brought in foreigners, this is speaking of the future, uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in flesh, to be in my sanctuary, to defile it, my house, our Creator's house, is coming back to this earth. It's not here literally now. Jerusalem has not been rebuilt with this, and it's very secular now, of course, and they don't have the Temple Mount and so forth. There's a lot of things that need to be fulfilled for this scriptures here to be fulfilled. He says, this is my house, and when you offered my food, the fat and the blood, and we see that even sacrifices will be restored, not for eternal salvation, but more of a remembrance of what the Mashiach had to suffer. Before the crucifixion, it was a foreshadow of what the Mashiach was going to go through, and apparently it will be permitted in the future. And even the rabbis today don't do sacrifice simply because they don't have the Temple Mount. The Shekinah glory is not there as it was in the past. It is left because of the abominations of Judah and Israel. But it will come back here, as we see, not just in terms of the Holy Spirit, as we have a down payment, or his faithful angels who are ministering and helping out the faithful believers in these times, but it will come in full glory in the future. And that's what this is talking about. I'm jumping into the context of this. The fat and the blood. And when they broke my covenant because of all your abominations, and you have not kept charge of my holy things, but you have set others to keep charge of my sanctuary for you. So here's a warning. Even though our Creator warns us, people still end up not listening. As the first and second temples were destroyed, they didn't listen to the prophets. Verse 9, thus says our Creator, no foreigner, uncircumcised in heart, or uncircumcised in flesh shall enter my sanctuary, including any foreigner who is among the children of Israel. So notice here, it doesn't say eternal salvation. It shows that there will be people outside the holy city who are still uncircumcised of heart and of flesh, and that our Creator is going to be patient in the future with all this, and that if you are uncircumcised either way, He will give you time to work on your relationship with Him. But we don't see anything about physical circumcision anywhere in the Scriptures for eternal salvation. And here we see for a closer relationship with Him, because you want to do what He says, and He allows you to get closer to Him in a physical way as a human being, that's great. But a lot of people look to the parable of the Messiah and say, hey, I'm just happy to be a gatekeeper. I don't mind being outside. As long as I can have eternal life, I'm happy with that. And we see that's acceptable if we're willing to do what He says, when He tells us. And not that we're perfect, not that any of the prophets or any of the men and women of the Scriptures were perfect, but grace and salvation can still come to us who are imperfect as we strive. We strive to be the best we can be. As He tells us in Matthew chapter 5:48, be ye perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. And so we're shooting for the bullseye. We're trying, and where we fall short, where we slip up, where we don't understand correctly, He works with us, and He loves us. Even while we're still sinners, He loves us. And He loves the world so much, He gave His only begotten Son for us. And in Peter even says, "Be ye holy as he is holy." And so, not that we should just say, just come as you are, and I don't have to change. No, He wants us to overcome. He wants us to change. But we need to understand the differences of what is required for eternal salvation, what is really in the Scripture. So let's go to the book of Romans. Now, one commenter said that Romans in a lot of this is just speaking to the Jewish people, and that's another Protestant teaching, that some commandments or laws are for just Jews, and some are just and Gentiles don't have to follow them. But the book of Romans was not written for just the Jews. And please don't get offended by that. I'm just showing what Paul taught. In fact, if we go to Romans chapter 11, let's go to Romans chapter 11, verse 13. Here the Apostle Shaul says, "For I speak to you Gentiles." Okay? He's speaking to you Gentiles out there, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles. I magnify my ministry. And he talks about in Romans 11 about Gentiles grafting in as wild branches into the same tree. We are to be of one faith, one body, one Spirit, one hope, and one God our Father, as we see in Ephesians. Not to be a schism between Jews and Gentiles, but the same. Everything is expected of all peoples, men, women. Some things are referred to men only, like physical circumcision, if you really feel obligated and you want to go that route. But we see that we need to understand Romans was not written to just the Jewish people. In fact, Rome, the city of Rome, is not in Israel. It's not anywhere near Jerusalem. It's in Italy, of course. The Rome was the capital of the Roman Empire. Is a big city, home of the Greeks, not home of the Jews. Okay, or the capital. It's not Jerusalem. So Paul was writing to Romans, and of course there was Jewish converts in there that accepted Messiah, but he was an apostle to the Gentiles more specifically. Although he did bring many Jews, and he preached to the Jewish people in Berea. We see, as I talked about in part 1 of this teaching. So, let's go back a little bit here. Let's understand this book of Romans, and also in chapter 7. He says, "Do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law." The Torah, the instructions, the written ones, not the oral, as I pointed out in part 1 of this teaching, that the law has dominion over a man. Doesn't say a Jew or anything like that, but a man as long as he lives. In verse 2, he even includes women. Okay, it's not just sometimes when you say men or mankind, we refer to men and women as well. So let's understand this properly, and let's go back a few verses here. In chapter 3, in verses 1, it says, "What advantage has the Jew?" What advantage do they have? Or what profit is circumcision? Physical circumcision. He says, "Much, in every way." Physically, spiritually, that is, and then back in chapter 2, verse 25, he says it's profitable. I'll get to that in a little bit. Again, not required for eternal salvation, though, okay? It's talking about the physical blessings that it brings in a physical lifespan. The Abrahamic covenant lives on. Look at the greatest inventors of our society, why we have all this technology, electricity, light bulbs, computers, the most powerful corporations, the founders, Google, Microsoft, IBM. You can go on and on and on. Hollywood, musicians, 3/4 the world-class musicians, even classical music, going back to Mozart and Bach and Beethoven, and even today in Hollywood, regardless of eternal salvation, the Abrahamic covenant has not been obsolete. And neither has the Davidic covenant of royalty, that King David's descendants, going from generation to generation, our Creator's preserved his descendants, and the Mashiach must be of the lineage, the line of David, King David. And that's part of the Davidic covenant that the Mashiach must fulfill, and did fulfill. And so it's important to understand that there are benefits. And this is why in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, the Apostle Shaul says, the gospel is for the Jews first, and then also for the Gentiles. But if the Jews won't teach it accurately or faithfully, and they're going to put their oral law and keep it above or equal, and not fulfill the letter of the laws of Moshe, then he will use the Gentiles also. And we see in the Old Covenant, even the Sinai Covenant, that Gentiles were grafted in. Rahab, the harlot, the Gentile harlot. Ruth, the whole book of Ruth is written on her, the Moabite, who becomes grafted in. And so this is also required of the New Covenant as well, that Gentiles be grafted in. But see, the Jewish people have preserved the holy oracles, as he says here in verse 2, much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles, entrusted to preserve the oracles of our Creator, the written law. It's not referring to the Talmud or the Mishnah. Those are the writings in the 2nd century of the oral law, all the strict, ultra-strict, ultra-conservative. The fence that was built around the whole Torah is written down, and whatever's in agreement of the written law, of course, is good. 2 thumbs up, all thumbs up. But what is against or not, clearly expounded upon properly, we need to realize that they're commandments of men. So, as we see in the scriptures here. But let's understand that there is advantages to circumcision, but it seems like Shaul contradicts himself in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 19. So let me go back to that. Here he says in 1 Corinthians 7:19, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of our Creator are what matters. So why does he say it's nothing here? Over in Romans he says that it is profitable. Well, the only way to really understand Paul properly here is sometimes even we as humans emphasize things differently over on this day or this time in this discussion, and over here we are emphasizing something a little bit differently. And have you ever been misquoted accurately but misunderstood, and people say, well, you're contradicting yourself? Well, that's what a lot of people, they don't understand Shaul here. He's saying circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. His emphasis is on eternal salvation, receiving that as a human being while you're still in the flesh, that you can receive salvation and the gift of life in a very special, meaningful way. And he also points out that we can become disqualified, we can fall from grace, and we got to be careful about that. But, we can receive these things, but keeping the commandments of our Creator is what matters. So, over in Romans, he's talking about physical circumcision, for physical blessings, but over in 1 Corinthians 7:19, he's saying it's nothing in regard to eternal salvation, and that is according to the written law that I expounded upon. In part 1 of this video teaching, and continuing in part 2 through the books of Devarim, Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so forth. So let's go back to understand this properly, and going back to Romans chapter 2. Now, Shalom and greetings, friends. Thank you for clicking on part 3, titled The Circumcision Schism. And I hope you've listened to part 1 and 2 before going through here in part 3. And if you have, I want to thank you very much for your time. I know our time is important, and to devote yourself to such spiritual topics and understandings of the Scriptures, or even checking up on me on what I'm teaching, I encourage you to do so, and I thank you very much. Whether you're in full agreement or not, I just appreciate people understanding the different ways of understanding the Scriptures and come to the conclusion that agrees with the whole Word, not just contradicts the whole Word, and taking Scriptures out of context. Now, before I pick up where I left on in part 2, let me also say, for those who might get offended, that please don't get offended. And let me say quite clearly and frankly that I do not teach that eternal salvation can only be received as a human based upon physical circumcision. I don't teach that, and I tried to make that clear at the beginning of part 2. But in case you hadn't listened to that, or part 1, I've got some comments where people misunderstand me in regard to this teaching from the Apostle Shaul, or Paul. And also from the written law. I explained the differences between the written law, or commandments, the Torah, the instructions, and the oral, which is from the rabbinical Jewish leaders. And if you still feel obligated that you should be circumcised, or your children, let me warn you, let me try to really emphasize that if you don't do it His way, the results can be quite gruesome. And if you rely on the secular hospitals who don't do it on the 8th day, as our Creator says to do it, well, then you are putting yourself into man's hands, and you're not relying on the Creator, and doing it His way. And so, I want to encourage you to research this topic as if any medical procedure that is important, even if like brain surgery, heart surgery, any kind of medical procedure, there's risks. And some people just do it for the purposes of having a better physical life, or have a longer physical life, to extend this human life. And so if you want to do that with circumcision, and I'm not trying to talk you into it, and I'm not going to put anybody down for wanting to do it, and as long as it's for the right reasons. Again, it's not to receive eternal salvation as a human. And so, if you've been mutilated, as some men out there, I feel very sorry and sympathetic, and my prayers are for you. And there are modern ways to help grow back anything that's been, excessively cut off and mutilated. And again, circumcision should never be for women or girls, okay, females. Okay, that it is against Scripture as well. So, when people misunderstood me in part 1, I removed comments that are very judgmental, accusing of lying, and we may be deceived. And you may be deceived, I may be deceived, but we're sincerely believing what we believe. And as the old saying goes, he or she who is deceived doesn't know that we're deceived. Otherwise, we wouldn't be deceived. Right? So, deceived is people who sincerely believe they're right, and let's please not get offended by this topic and cause schisms and divisions. And if you're an Orthodox rabbinical leader, or even an Orthodox Jew, please don't get offended, and try to understand that from the written Torah, that's what the apostles taught the Messiah, Yeshua. The Greeks changed his name to Jesus, so most people are referring to him as Jesus. He didn't teach against the written law, the written law of Moshe. In fact, he magnified it, and so did his faithful disciples in the first century, and as we have their writings. And so I'm going through this because Protestant theology has taken the writings out of context. They have distorted it with an anti-Semitic umbrella, and have even, in centuries past, put many of us to death. Many of our spiritual or physical forefathers, Jews and Messianics, Hebrew roots, people restoring their Hebrew roots, they label them as Judaizers, and I have a teaching on Judaizers and who are they truly, and the history as well. And let's try to understand our theology based upon what is right, and be willing to think outside the box of our background, our upbringing, our teaching, our dysfunctional backgrounds as well as our functional backgrounds, okay? Let's really get to the heart of the matter. Let's try to get to the truth of these things, because it is very important. Very important, because as I pointed out in part 2, the Abrahamic covenant lives on. It has not been made obsolete. The Davidic covenant has not been made obsolete. The Noah covenant, we still have rainbows, according to science. The science should agree with Scripture. Scripture should agree with science. But be careful. A lot of scientists out there are anti-Semitic. And don't just believe everything you see on the internet. And people can do research, they can do and show evidence of the wrong ways to do things, and yet, the Scripture tells us the right way to do things, and yet they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so let's be careful of biased research, biased opinions, experts, doctorates, scholars. There's a lot of debate in every topic in our society today, whether it be nutrition, agriculture, history, exercise physiology, you name it. Experts and leading experts will even disagree on certain issues. So I want to just encourage you, though, to do your own research. I'm not going to get into the medical and my opinions and what I lean toward, but I'm just going to get to the Scriptures and teach it as accurately as I feel revealed by Him. And so let's go forward with that in this part 3. And I left off in Romans chapter 2 in verse 13. And as I pointed out in the part 2 of this video series teaching, is that the book of Romans was written to the Gentiles, not just to the Jews, as some people still believe out there. In fact, the majority of Protestant believers out there in different denominations and non-denominations. And in Romans chapter 11, verse 13, Paul says, I speak to you Gentiles. Okay, Rome was home of the Greeks. Okay, and of course there were Jews, and Paul preached to the Jews as well as to the Gentiles. And in part 2, I covered, and also part 1, part of the written law, how to understand circumcision properly in regard to salvation. But also now I've been diving into the New Testament, as many of you call it. The Brit Hadashah means New Covenant. Okay? And it's interesting, Britain is a Hebrew word, or British. Brit means covenant. British, or Britain, refers to covenant man, or the covenant people. And so the United States and Great Britain have not been anti-Semitic, and they may become more so in the end times here, but the Creator has blessed these nations. And it should be no wonder why, as we understand the Abrahamic covenant living on, and as well as even the Davidic covenant, and that our Creator honors those covenants. Now in Hebrews chapter 8 verse 13, it talks about an obsolete covenant. The author of Hebrews is saying that was vanishing away as that book was written. Of course, the temple was still up at that time. The sacrificial system was still going. The Levite, or the rabbinical leaders, the scribes and Pharisees were still, the Sanhedrin was still controlling the temple. And so it had not vanished away until 70 A.D. when that temple was destroyed, of course. And so as it was vanishing away, it left room for the growth and expansion of the Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant teachings and writings and believers to go forward and preaching this gospel throughout the earth. And as it says in Romans 1:16, this gospel is for the Jews first and also for the Gentiles. But if the Jews are unwilling, he will use Gentiles more and more powerfully and bring to jealousy the Jewish people as they're unwilling to. But there are many people restoring their Hebrew roots, and many Jews and Gentiles, and we should all be of the same body, not one teaching different things and other things here and there. So I covered Acts 15 in part 1. I covered a lot of important scriptures. So if you haven't listened to part 1 and 2 of this video teachings, the Circumcision Schism, please do so. But in Romans, Paul writes to the Gentiles and also to Jewish people, "For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of our Creator," not just the hearers, "but the doers of the written law," the Torah, the instructions, that's what it should be referred to as, "will be justified." And we see in James chapter 2. And even though Martin Luther and others said that the book of James is just an epistle of straw, it's not just an epistle of straw. It is very meaningful. The book of Hebrews, James, and Jude are not epistles of straw, regardless of what Protestant theology has been teaching. Now, you just Google search epistles of straw and look who taught that and who's been teaching that. Now, jumping down to verse 25 of Romans chapter 2. "For circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law." Now, this is where people, it's impossible to keep the law. So, of course, that means it's only profitable if you can keep it perfectly. It doesn't say if you keep the law perfectly. None of us can in the flesh. None of us have that I know of, other than the Messiah, the Mashiach, the perfect sacrifice for us. The Hebrews 11, these men had grace. Women of the Old Covenant had grace and forgiveness, and they will be resurrected to eternal life in the right time. But if you are a breaker of the law, deliberately, of course, your circumcision has become as uncircumcision. So here we see physical circumcision is not profitable if you are deliberately and willfully and continuing to break the law. Of course, we are to strive for perfection. Matthew 5:48 says, "Be ye perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect." And even Peter says, "Be holy as he is holy." And so we're striving for that. We may not be that, but we're striving for that maturity, that spirituality. And it's a lifelong process of growing. Just like children, growing up, becoming more and more like their parents. Starting out as just a little seed and just a little growth, and becoming more and more in the image and the likeness of our Creator here. And that's what we're striving. But verse 26, notice this carefully. "Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law," here we see there are righteous requirements. Where in most of Protestant Christian theology, there's nothing you can do to receive salvation, and that you don't have to keep that law. It was nailed to the cross. It was done away with. And so they pick and choose which ones they're done away with, which ones are not. And let's be careful not to do that. Let's look at what Paul says here. There are righteous requirements. "Will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision?" And we're going to get to here in chapter 3 or 4, Abraham was not circumcised till he was 90 years old. And he was given salvation while he was uncircumcised. So his uncircumcised days before age 90 were counted as circumcised. He was offered salvation. The Abrahamic covenant began before he was 90 years old. And so we need to understand these things. I'll get to that in more detail. But notice here in verse 27, but if the physically uncircumcised, will he, if he fulfills the law, the uncircumcised physically, if he fulfills the law. Here we see it is possible. Not perfectly, that's where we need grace, but we are to strive for it. Judge you, even with your written code of circumcision, are a transgressor of the Torah. So even if you have that certificate of circumcised by the rabbis on the 8th day, and it's done completely according to the scriptures and the way the Creator taught Abraham and his descendants to do it, even Ishmael and many what we call the Islamic people, descendants of Ishmael, are still doing physical circumcision as well. You know, he's talking about here that if we can fulfill the law, even if we're uncircumcised, but those who are physically circumcised, if we're transgressors, if we become secular and anti-Semitic against our own Hebrew roots, and turn away from our calling, our genetic calling as Jews, then being circumcised is of no value. Again, no value. For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, of the flesh, nor is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart. Here we're talking about eternal salvation, fulfilling the law, and it is in the Spirit. And so here's what, in the Spirit. So here we have the concept of being a spiritual Jew or a spiritual Israelite, because if you know whether you're physically circumcised or not, but whose praise is not from men, but from our Creator. So we are to not just be pleasers of men or do what men expect us to do, or mankind or society or majority, but do what He expects us to do. Okay? And let's jump over to Romans chapter 4, verses 9 through 12 here. This is where we're talking about Abraham, as I briefly mentioned here. It says, does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? He's talking physical circumcision. For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. He was declared righteous. How then is he accounted? While he was physically circumcised or uncircumcised? He says not while he was physically circumcised, but while he was uncircumcised. So here's Paul teaching circumcision according to the law, and he's trying to show it's an oral law, as I pointed out in parts 1 and 2, that you have to be physically circumcised for salvation. But that doesn't mean we should put people down and attack or persecute or hate people or say you're under a curse if you want to fulfill the letter of the law the best you can. And that's where mainstream Christianity has gone to the other end of the pendulum here, in the wrong way. Okay? So, he says, not while physically circumcised, but while he was uncircumcised, Abraham was declared righteous, and he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised. Physically. That he might be the father of all who believe. So he's the father of the faithful, of the uncircumcised physically and the circumcised physically. That he might be the father of those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also, those who are physically uncircumcised. Okay? and the father of the circumcised, to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who walk in the steps and the faith of our father Abraham had while he was still uncircumcised. Okay? So this is the big picture here that he's trying to point out, that we should not push it on people to be physically circumcised. We should not require it, as rabbinical, Orthodox Judaism has. To become a Jew, you have to prove your conversion through physical circumcision. And this is where it comes from, the oral, not from the written Torah. In Protestant theology, and even I was taught and believed for years, that there's a huge paradigm shift of what Paul taught in the first century believers about circumcision. A huge paradigm shift in teaching from the written law. But it was a paradigm shift for those who were stuck in the oral law as being equal or higher authority than the written. And so let's please understand that. And so does that mean, as Gentiles and Jews, that we just abolish the law, that it's done away with? Of course not. In chapter 3, verse 31, Paul says here, "Do we then make void the law? Do we abolish the law? Do we make void the Torah through faith? Certainly not." Get that exclamation mark even in the translation here. "On the contrary, we establish the law," the written Torah. Of course, he's talking about the written, not the oral. And in jumping over to chapter 7 and verse 12, he says, "Therefore the law is holy." Now, mainstream Christianity will say, well, if you strive to keep the law of Moses, the written law, it is a curse, and you will be cursed. And this is not what Paul taught. He says in verse 12 of Romans, "For the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and just and good." It is for our good. Our Creator's commandments, He wants us to learn to love Him and each other. Not persecute or attack or kill or martyr or in any way those who disagree with us. As we see here, we are to even love our enemies as believers and not attack people and force things. We have freedom of religion in this country, in the United States of America and Great Britain and many countries. Let's be thankful for that, and not push or judge people or attack or persecute or bomb or hurt or harm people who have disagreements with us. Let's lead by example. Okay? And jumping back to even verse 1 here, chapter 7, "For you do not know, brethren, that I speak to those who know the law, that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives." Not the Jew, but mankind. Okay? And he even mentions women, starting in verse 2 here. So let's understand Paul. At the end of Peter's writings, in 2 Peter chapter 3 there, and he says, Paul writes things that are hard to understand, and people who are untaught to what? The Torah. They twist to their own destruction. Men of lawlessness, as you see in the NIV. Lawlessness. And so we need to be careful against those who are teaching against the written law. And the oral law is what the apostles and the Messiah taught against, that are contrary or in disagreement or against the written law as we should understand it properly. And so let's continue to understand this topic. Let's continue to learn and understand this more accurately and not take this topic lightly. Let's not put people down and just label them with put down names or titles such as Judaizers or heretics and things like that, because they want to keep the commandments which teach us how to love Him, the 10. The 10 that we see that in two different places in Scripture. We see it in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Those 10, he had to put down in writing, but they pre-existed the Jewish people by over 2,000 years. And no wonder. Okay, I'll put this in writing because my people keep forgetting. They keep going astray. They build this golden calf after I spoke it to them verbally. And so later on he puts it down in stone so that it can be preserved. And so it's very important. The first 4 of those 10 show us how to love him. The next 6 show us how to love each other. And most Christians will agree with 9 of those 10. But that one, the 4th one, that's Jewish, they say. Even the Messiah said the Shabbat was made for man, not just the Jew. And he says in Matthew chapter 24, verse 20, he says, "Pray that your flight be not in the winter or on a Shabbat day." A prophecy of the end of this age. Still to be important. In Isaiah chapter 66, verses 22 and 23, it says, "With a new heavens and a new earth, which will stand forever." Well, he will rebuild. We don't see that fulfilled yet. He says, "On every Shabbat and every new moon, all flesh will come before me." Not just the Jewish people, but all flesh. Grafted into the same tree, as we read about in Romans chapter 11. So let's not get involved with and be a part of schisms or push it in a wrong way because people want to fulfill the Scriptures and live by every word of it accurately. Let's not do that. Let's try to seek His will. Let's try to seek His way, as the Messiah said in Matthew chapter 5. He says, "Those who teach the least of these commandments will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But those who teach and do them will be called great." And he's not talking about the oral law, but he's talking about the written Torah. And so I teach even the least of them based upon what they say. And of course we understand the sacrificial system, who fulfilled that. We understand there's no temple and that there's no requirement now to do that. But whatever we see in the Brit Hadashah, we need to understand it is a magnification and a better understanding of the written Torah, and not against it. And let's please not get offended by this. Please don't take it lightly. Check up on me. Don't just believe me. Don't just believe what your pastor, your rabbi, your atheistic peers or Christian or Islamic or whatever background or faith you're in right now. Let's think outside that box. Let's grow and become His people, what He wanted us to be, even with Noah. There's no evidence that Noah was circumcised. Enoch, long before Abraham. And we see even Noah lived while Abraham was alive. When you look at the Torah more closely, that Noah, when he died, Abraham, I believe, off the top of my head, I think he was 35 or 50 years old. I have to go back and look at that in more detail. But there's an overlap of Noah. We also see Enoch and other faithful ones. There's no evidence of physical circumcision before Abraham. So let's be men and women of faith. And let's do what He clearly tells us to do, and don't put your trust in men and what they teach, and especially if it's against what you see and hear. But go forward. Go forward spiritually. Walk with Him.